The radio came alive with static and voices on August 15, 1945. It was exactly noon. An American intelligence post sat outside Manila in a building that had been hastily converted for military use. The war had ended. For the first time in history, Emperor Hirohito's voice reached ordinary Japanese citizens through their radios. His announcement confirmed Japan's surrender to Allied forces. But 40 miles north of Manila, inside what used to be a Catholic convent, Major Catherine Brennan from the Women's Army Corps held a classified document in her trembling hands. That report would disturb her sleep for decades to come. The papers revealed something that would barely make it into history books. 847 Japanese women sat in Allied detention camps scattered across 12 different Pacific locations. Military records classified them as civilian detainees. These women were not the comfort women that historians would later study and remember. They were not military nurses or soldiers. They were something completely different. They were the forgotten victims of a war that had no rules for dealing with their situation. Their story spans 18 months between Japan's surrender and their eventual return home. It challenges everything people thought they knew about warfare, about women, and about basic human decency in the Pacific. Their experiences remained buried in classified government files for decades. Veterans whispered about them in memoirs. Official military histories largely ignored their existence completely. Allied forces moving through Pacific Islands between 1944 and 1945 prepared for many possibilities. They knew they would face desperate resistance from Japanese soldiers. They expected booby traps hidden everywhere they advanced. They prepared for suicide charges when Japanese forces faced defeat. They understood that Japanese soldiers would choose death over surrender. Nobody prepared them to find Japanese women in places where military intelligence said no women could possibly be. The first major discovery happened on February 28, 1945. Allied forces were liberating Los Baños internment camp in the Philippines. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mueller led a reconnaissance team ahead of the main rescue operation. His team stumbled onto a separate compound that housed 73 Japanese women and 12 children. Official Army documentation describes the complete confusion that followed this discovery. These women were not prison guards. The Japanese had held them as prisoners too. Military records show they were wives, sisters, and daughters of Japanese civilian workers. These men had been sent to manage territories that Japan had conquered and occupied. The discovery created an immediate crisis for military bureaucrats. The Geneva Convention had rules for treating prisoners of war. Those rules assumed the prisoners would be male soldiers. Guidelines for handling civilian detainees were written for European refugees fleeing the war. Nobody had written protocols for enemy civilians from Asian nations. Lieutenant General Walter Kruger commanded the Sixth Army at that time. He sent an urgent message to MacArthur's headquarters requesting immediate instructions. His cable stated that no existing military protocols could handle Japanese female civilian detainees. The problem grew larger as American forces continued advancing through the Philippines, Okinawa, and the occupied Dutch East Indies. Marine intelligence officers on Leyte found 34 Japanese women working as administrative clerks in a naval supply depot. On Saipan, advancing Army units discovered 127 women and children hiding in cave systems. They had separated themselves from Japanese military personnel who had committed suicide rather than face capture. Each new discovery created the same impossible legal and moral questions. Major Brennan eventually supervised the largest detention facility for these women. Her personal diary entries are now stored in the National Archives. She wrote about the impossible situation they faced. The military had trained them to handle enemy soldiers as prisoners of war. They knew how to process civilian refugees fleeing combat zones. But these women fit into no category that anyone understood. They were civilians from an enemy nation, but they posed no military threat to Allied forces. They were non-combatants, but they came from a country that had shown no mercy to Allied civilians. They were women and children, but they represented a government that Allied forces had been fighting to completely destroy. By April 1945, the War Department created a classification system to determine how these women would be treated. Document WD-452B was declassified in 1972. It established 3 distinct categories for Japanese female detainees. Category A included women with direct connections to Japanese military or intelligence operations. Category B covered wives and family members of civilian administrators working in occupied territories. Category C included women who had been living in occupied areas with no official government positions. These classifications would determine everything about how these women were treated. They affected detention conditions, daily routines, and chances for eventual return to Japan. The numbers grew more alarming each week. Allied forces held 312 Japanese women across various facilities by May 1945. By the end of June, that number had increased to 581 women. When the war ended on August 15th, the total had reached 847 women and 203 children. They were spread across 12 detention centers stretching from Manila to Guam. The creation of detention protocols for Japanese women revealed a massive oversight in American military planning. The War Department had spent years preparing for every possible scenario in Pacific warfare. They had detailed plans for amphibious beach assaults. They had prepared for jungle combat in unfamiliar terrain. They had protocols for governing occupied territories after victory. But nobody had considered what to do with enemy women who were neither soldiers nor traditional civilian refugees. Captain Eleanor Hutchinson worked in the Provost Marshal's office in Manila. She documented the complete bureaucratic chaos in official reports now preserved at the Military History Institute. Her August 1945 memorandum described the situation with brutal honesty. They were detaining Japanese women under authority designed for prisoners of war. But these women had never been combatants. They housed them in facilities built for Filipino internees. But these women were enemy nationals. They guarded them using protocols written for male prisoners, but the detainees were women and children. Every regulation they applied was pure improvisation with no legal foundation. The first major challenge was basic infrastructure. Existing prisoner of war camps had been designed for Japanese soldiers. They featured open barracks buildings, communal bathroom facilities, and security measures appropriate for military prisoners. Detaining women and children required completely different considerations. Women needed privacy that the camps could not provide. They needed sanitation facilities designed for female hygiene needs. Pregnant women needed medical care that military doctors were not trained to provide. Children needed protection from external threats and from dangers within the camps themselves. Major Brennan's facility at Camp Clayton became the largest detention center for Japanese women. The camp was established in a former Philippine normal school located outside Manila. War Department records show that between April and December 1945, the facility housed 394 Japanese women and 127 children. Brennan kept meticulous daily logs that have since been declassified. They reveal the unprecedented challenges she faced every single day. On May 3, 1945, she wrote about receiving 47 new detainees transferred from Leyte. 12 of the women were pregnant. The camp medical staff had no experience providing obstetric care to expectant mothers. She had requested Navy medical personnel with appropriate training for childbirth. Meanwhile, the camp doctor, Captain James Rutherford, was reading medical textbooks and hoping for the best possible outcomes. On June 18, 1945, she attempted to implement standard military meal schedules for the detainees. The Japanese women refused to eat at the prescribed military times. They were cooking rice in their living quarters using improvised methods that created serious fire hazards throughout the facility. The camp lacked interpreters who understood Japanese dietary requirements or cultural food practices. Every single meal became a complex negotiation between guards and detainees. On July 7, 1945, a delegation of Japanese women approached Major Brennan with a formal request. The group was led by a former teacher named Hanako Yamamoto. They presented a petition asking for permission to establish a school for the children in the camp. The request was written in perfect English, with proper grammar and formal language. Major Brennan noted the irony in her diary. They were denying education to children from a nation that had denied freedom to millions of people across Asia and the Pacific. But military orders were absolutely clear. Detainees should receive minimal accommodation only. No privileges could be provided that might be interpreted as cooperation with enemy nationals. The psychological complexity of detention extended far beyond physical living conditions. American guards, many of them women serving in the Women's Army Corps, found themselves confronting their own deep prejudices and wartime assumptions about the enemy. Corporal Dorothy Vincent came from Ohio. She kept a personal diary throughout her service at Camp Clayton. Her entries were donated to the Veterans History Project in 1998. They capture the cognitive dissonance that guards experience daily. On August 2, 1945, she watched Japanese women celebrating something they called Tanabata. She learned it was some kind of traditional star festival from their culture. The women made decorations using scraps of paper they had collected. They sang traditional songs to their children in Japanese. Vincent found herself crying as she watched the celebration. She wrote that these were supposed to be the enemy. These were the same people responsible for the Bataan Death March, for Pearl Harbor, for everything American forces had been fighting against for 4 years. But watching them with their children, she saw her own mother and her own sisters. War makes monsters of everyone by demanding that people forget their common humanity. The three-category classification system established by War Department document WD-452B determined not just detention conditions, but the actual survival prospects of hundreds of Japanese women. The system was created hastily by bureaucrats working thousands of miles away from the Pacific Theater. It failed completely to account for the complex realities these women actually represented. Category A detainees were those identified as having direct military or intelligence connections. Only 23 women across all facilities received this classification. Investigation files from the Counterintelligence Corps were declassified in 1983. They reveal the extremely thin evidence often used to justify this harsh classification. One woman named Reiko Watanabe was designated Category A solely because she had worked as a secretary for the Osaka Municipal Government's Public Works Department before the war began. The classification form noted that the subject possessed typing and stenography skills. Military intelligence concluded she may have had access to documents of potential intelligence value. The fact that she had been typing routine road maintenance reports was deemed completely irrelevant to her classification. Category A designation carried severe consequences for the women who received it. These women were completely segregated from the general detention population. They were subjected to regular interrogation sessions by military intelligence officers. They were denied access to Red Cross packages that other detainees received. They were placed last on any lists for repatriation to Japan. Army intelligence documents show that the 23 Category A women were interrogated an average of 47 times each between August 1945 and June 1946. The interrogation reports were stamped confidential and buried in military archives for decades. They revealed the complete futility of this entire process. Of 1,881 total interrogation sessions, 1,663 produced absolutely no intelligence information of any value whatsoever. Category B represented the largest group of detainees. 673 women were classified as family members of civilian administrators in occupied territories. These were wives of government officials, postal workers, school teachers, and civil engineers who had been sent to manage Japanese-occupied regions throughout Asia and the Pacific. The War Department's reasoning was straightforward. These women had directly benefited from Japan's imperial expansion across the Pacific. They should remain detained until their husband's or father's level of complicity in the occupation could be thoroughly investigated and assessed. Lieutenant Patricia Morrison was assigned as liaison officer for Category B detainees at Camp Clayton. She described the completely arbitrary nature of these classifications in her after-action report filed with military headquarters. She interviewed a woman named Fumiko Tanaka, whose husband had been a postal clerk working in Manila. The woman had lived there for 8 months before American Liberation Forces arrived. Military investigators detained her and her 3 children for 14 months, while they investigated whether her husband had administrative complicity in the Japanese occupation of the Philippines. The investigation eventually concluded that he had sorted mail for the postal system. This woman and her children spent over a year behind barbed wire because her husband had been a mailman delivering letters. Category C was the smallest group with only 151 women. It covered those who had been living in occupied territories with no official government connection whatsoever. These included teachers who had volunteered for positions in occupied schools, wives of merchants, and women who had simply followed their families to territories Japan had conquered. This classification theoretically should have guaranteed the quickest repatriation to Japan, but the reality proved far more complicated than military planners had anticipated. The classification system created a distinct hierarchy of suffering within the detention camps. Category A, women were isolated from others and repeatedly interrogated by military intelligence. They developed what camp medical officers described as interrogation fatigue syndrome. This condition was characterized by severe paranoia, chronic insomnia, and debilitating anxiety that affected their daily functioning. Category B women comprised the vast majority of detainees. They lived in a state of indefinite uncertainty, never knowing when or even if they would ever be allowed to return to Japan. Category C women were theoretically the most fortunate group, but they often faced the greatest identity crisis of all. They questioned whether they even belonged in Japan anymore after spending years living abroad in occupied territories. The turning point in the treatment of Japanese female detainees came from a completely unexpected source. American women who had themselves survived Japanese internment camps during the war decided to take action. In September 1945, a group of 14 former civilian internees from Santo Tomas and Los Baños camps petitioned General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters with a request that stunned military officials throughout the Pacific Command structure. The petition is preserved in MacArthur's personal papers at the MacArthur Memorial Archives. It stated that the undersigned former internees of Japanese detention facilities in the Philippine Islands hereby requested permission to visit and assess current conditions at Camp Clayton and other facilities housing Japanese female detainees. Having experienced detention themselves under Japanese occupation, they believed they possessed unique insight into the humanitarian requirements necessary for such detention facilities. Colonel Frank Randolph served as MacArthur's Chief of Staff for Civil Affairs. He initially recommended denying the request completely. His memorandum dated September 18, 1945, argued that allowing former victims of Japanese cruelty to visit facilities housing Japanese nationals created unacceptable risks of violent confrontation and revenge attacks. The public relations implications were completely untenable for military leadership. But MacArthur made a decision that would remain controversial throughout military circles. He approved the visits against his staff's recommendations. His handwritten note on the denial recommendation read simply that if American forces became what they had fought against, they would have lost regardless of military victory. He approved the request with appropriate security measures in place. The first visit occurred on October 3, 1945. Virginia Hewlett had been a missionary who spent 38 months detained in Santo Tomas internment camp. She led a delegation of 6 women to Camp Clayton for the inspection. Major Brennan's diary entry from that day captures the extreme tension everyone felt. She had never been more anxious about any inspection in her military career. These women had suffered genuine horrors under Japanese detention for years. She feared violence, direct confrontation, or at minimum harsh judgment that would validate the most punitive policies toward their Japanese detainees. What actually happened instead completely transformed the entire American approach to Japanese female detention. Hewlett's official report was submitted to MacArthur's headquarters on October 15, 1945. It detailed systematic deficiencies in Camp Clayton's operations with devastating precision. The report's language was both clinical and damning. Medical facilities were completely inadequate for obstetric care of pregnant women. Sanitation provisions were insufficient for the population density in the camp. Nutritional standards fell below minimum requirements for nursing mothers and growing children. Educational provisions for children were completely non-existent. Mental health resources were entirely absent from the facility. The report continued with a comparison that made military officials deeply uncomfortable throughout the command structure. The delegation had observed conditions that, while not approaching the deliberate cruelty they had experienced under Japanese detention, nevertheless fell below the standards they expected the United States to maintain for any human beings. The women and children detained at Camp Clayton were receiving approximately 1,800 calories per day. The American internees had received less during their own captivity, but they had expected cruelty from their Japanese captors. These Japanese detainees should reasonably expect better treatment from American forces. Hewlett's recommendations were comprehensive and demanded immediate implementation. Daily caloric intake should be increased to 2,400 calories for women and 2,800 calories for nursing mothers. The camp should establish proper medical facilities staffed with trained obstetric personnel. Educational programs must be created for all children. Mental health resources should be provided for detainees suffering psychological trauma. Limited self-governance should be allowed within the camps. Cultural and religious practices should be permitted as long as they posed no security threats to the facility. The impact was immediate and dramatic. On October 28, 1945, MacArthur's headquarters issued General Order 247. It implemented most of Hewlett's recommendations across all detention facilities housing Japanese women throughout the Pacific Theater. The order marked a fundamental shift in American policy. Instead of viewing these women primarily as enemy nationals, the military began recognizing them as human beings entitled to basic dignity regardless of their nation's wartime actions. Major Brennan recorded the changes in her November 1st diary entry. They had increased meal rations, opened a makeshift school, and allowed the women to establish their own internal governance committee. The change in atmosphere was remarkable and immediate. The women had been existing in a state of fearful passivity for months. Now they were organizing daily activities, planning for their children's futures, teaching in the school, and engaging with American personnel as human beings, rather than simply as jailers. Virginia Hewlett had accomplished in 1 month what Major Brennan had failed to achieve in 6 months of military administration. The 203 children detained alongside their mothers represented perhaps the most challenging aspect of the entire detention system. These children ranged from infants born in custody to teenagers who still remembered pre-war life in Japan. They existed in a legal and moral gray zone that exposed the severe limitations of military justice and international law. Captain Sarah Donnelly had been an elementary school teacher from Massachusetts before joining the Women's Army Corps. She was assigned as education officer for Camp Clayton in November 1945. Her appointment came directly from the implementation of General Order 247. Donnelly's personal papers were donated to the Women in Military Service for America Memorial in 1994. They provide extraordinary insight into the children's daily experiences in detention. Her first diary entry as education officer was dated November 8, 1945. It described her initial assessment of the educational situation. She counted 73 children of school age among the detainees. The youngest was 6 years old, and the oldest was 15. They had received absolutely no formal education since their detention began. Some had been without schooling for as long as 18 months. They were being raised behind barbed wire, watching their mothers live in constant fear and uncertainty about their futures. They were learning that the world was divided into guards and prisoners. They were discovering that authority meant coercion and force. They were being taught that their identity as Japanese made them enemies even as innocent children. The establishment of the camp school on November 15, 1945, created immediate complications for military administration. The War Department had authorized education, but provided absolutely no guidance on curriculum content. Should these children be taught in Japanese or English? Should the curriculum include Japanese cultural content, or focus solely on practical skills for survival? Should American values be promoted, or would that constitute indoctrination of enemy children? Donnelly's solution was both pragmatic and revolutionary for military detention. She recruited Hanako Yamamoto, the former teacher who had petitioned for a school months earlier, as the lead instructor. Together, they created a bilingual curriculum that taught basic mathematics, literacy in both Japanese and English, science, and what Donnelly called universal moral principles. These were lessons on kindness, honesty, and mutual respect that transcended national identity and wartime hatred. The school operated in a converted storage building using completely salvaged materials. Chalkboards were made from wooden panels painted black. Textbooks were created by hand using paper requisitioned from military supplies. Teaching materials included whatever could be improvised from available camp resources. Despite these severe limitations, attendance was absolutely universal. Every school-aged child attended classes every single day, without exception. Lieutenant Morrison observed the school's operations in December 1945. She filed a report that captured the surreal nature of the entire situation. She watched American guards standing watch while Japanese children sang traditional songs in their native language. They were learning lessons about Japanese folklore and cultural traditions. 6 months earlier, American forces had been fighting to destroy everything these children represented. Now, they were actively enabling the preservation of Japanese culture and identity. The cognitive dissonance was profound, Yet somehow this approach felt more aligned with fundamental American values than anything else they had accomplished in the detention facility. The children's experiences varied dramatically based on their ages when detained. Young children, particularly those under 8 years old, adapted with remarkable resilience to camp life. They played games with toys improvised from camp materials. They formed friendships across different family groups. They treated the camp as simply the world they knew and accepted it as normal. Donnelly's notes from February 1946 described a birthday party organized for 6-year-old Kenji Matsumoto. The children had fashioned decorations from paper scraps they collected. The mothers had pooled their food rations to create a small cake for the celebration. They sang songs and played games together. For 2 hours, the barbed wire surrounding the camp seemed to disappear completely. These children were simply children celebrating a friend's birthday. Older children and teenagers faced much more complex psychological challenges in detention. 15-year-old Akira Nakamura spoke fluent English and served as an interpreter for camp administration. His personal diary was confiscated during a routine security inspection, but later returned and preserved in military archives. The diary revealed the internal conflict of normal adolescence compounded by indefinite detention. He wrote about feeling caught between two worlds, Japanese culture that his mother desperately wanted to preserve, and American culture that surrounded him daily in the camp. The announcement of Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, should have marked the beginning of the end for the detention of Japanese women and children. Instead, it initiated a bureaucratic nightmare that would extend their captivity by more than a year. It exposed the complete absence of planning for their eventual return to a defeated Japan. MacArthur's headquarters created a repatriation planning committee on August 20, 1945. The committee had one clear mission: return all Japanese civilians to their homeland by December 1945. This seemed achievable at first glance. Document RPC-14 sat locked in classified files for over 4 decades. When declassification came in 1989, the papers revealed a plan of stunning simplicity. Transport ships would collect Japanese military prisoners. The same vessels would gather civilian detainees from multiple locations. Designated ports in Japan would receive these returnees. Japanese authorities would take charge immediately. Home regions would welcome back their displaced citizens. Reality shattered this neat blueprint within weeks. The Japan of late 1945 bore no resemblance to the empire that had launched war 4 years earlier. Hiroshima lay in radioactive ruins. Nagasaki had vanished under atomic fire. These 2 catastrophic moments marked only the beginning of devastation. Conventional bombing campaigns had systematically erased 66 major cities from existence. Infrastructure meant nothing when it no longer existed. Railways twisted into metal sculptures. Bridges collapsed into rivers they once spanned. Roads disappeared under rubble mountains. Ports struggled with skeleton crews and damaged equipment. Food shortages threatened something worse than hardship. Mass starvation loomed over the entire nation. Agricultural areas had been abandoned as men went to war. Farmers who survived returned to find fields barren and equipment destroyed. Distribution networks had completely broken down. Cities faced the prospect of watching their populations slowly die from hunger. Transportation networks existed only in memory. What trains still ran carried essential supplies for occupation forces. Civilian movement ranked far below military priorities. Local governments operated from temporary buildings when they operated at all. Many areas had no functioning civil authority whatsoever. Colonel Thomas Wickham arrived at his new assignment with military efficiency and organizational confidence. His title carried impressive weight: Chief Repatriation Officer for Civilian Detainees. The reality proved far less impressive than the title suggested. Wickham's September 1945 report documented a crisis that defied military solutions. Japanese government representatives had communicated their position with brutal honesty. They could not guarantee safety for repatriated civilians. They certainly could not guarantee survival. Women and children without male family members faced the worst prospects. The nation's resources were completely dedicated to one overwhelming task: preventing mass starvation of people already inside Japan. Adding thousands of returnees would overwhelm their capacity entirely. The system would collapse under additional pressure. The Japanese officials made no apologies for this harsh calculation. Survival required impossible choices. The status of male relatives complicated everything further. Husbands had been separated from wives months or years earlier. Fathers had left children in civilian detention while they faced military imprisonment. Brothers had vanished into the chaos of war's final months. Many men remained locked in military POW camps scattered across the Pacific. Others faced war crimes investigations that could continue for years. Some had died in combat or imprisonment. Their families would never know their fate. Missing persons lists stretched endlessly with no hope of resolution. The detained women faced a terrible prospect: return to a devastated homeland with no support system, no means of survival. No family structure to depend upon, no economic opportunities in a collapsed society. Major Brennan understood the human cost of bureaucratic failure. Her diary entries from late 1945 captured growing desperation behind the official language of military reports. October 22nd brought the announcement that would shatter hopes and destroy faith in American promises. Repatriation faced indefinite postponement. The words hit the women like physical blows. Several collapsed immediately upon hearing the news. Fumiko Tanaka had been detained for 16 months. She began screaming that promises had been made and broken. Her accusation carried painful accuracy. Promises had indeed been made. American authorities had assured detainees that release would follow war's end. Victory had come in August. October arrived with no freedom in sight. Christmas would find families still behind barbed wire. Not because the war continued, because peace had created new problems that no one had anticipated. The psychological impact of indefinite detention during peacetime proved devastating. Women who had maintained composure throughout active warfare collapsed emotionally when continued captivity became reality. The war was over. Enemy action no longer justified their imprisonment. Yet prison remained their daily reality. Camp medical records from November and December 1945 documented a surge in what doctors termed post-surrender depression syndrome. The medical terminology couldn't capture the human anguish. Women who had survived bombing, invasion, and occupation broke down when faced with extended captivity during peace. Suicide attempts increased dramatically. Medical personnel reported 12 women attempted self-harm in November alone. The previous 6 months of active warfare had seen only 3 total attempts. Peace brought more despair than war had generated. The International Red Cross had maintained limited contact with detention facilities throughout the conflict. Wartime restrictions had prevented extensive involvement. Japan's surrender changed everything. Humanitarian organizations could now operate with full access to assess conditions and advocate for prisoners' rights. Delegate Friedrich Kellerman visited Camp Clayton on November 30, 1945. His inspection was thorough, and his conclusions were damning. The report he filed with Red Cross headquarters in Geneva used diplomatic language, but delivered unmistakable criticism. These women and children existed without charges filed against them. No trials had determined their guilt of any crime. The justification of ongoing warfare had evaporated with Japan's surrender. They existed in legal limbo that defied international law and humanitarian principles. They were not prisoners of war entitled to Geneva Convention protections. They were not civilian detainees with clearly defined rights under international agreements. They occupied a gray zone that served no legitimate purpose. The United States government faced immediate pressure to resolve this untenable situation. Pressure from international humanitarian organizations combined with growing media attention to force action. The War Department could no longer ignore the contradiction of detaining enemy civilians after the enemy had surrendered unconditionally. December 15, 1945, brought the announcement of a phased repatriation program. The plan divided detainees into priority groups based on multiple factors. Family situation determined some priorities. Health status affected placement. Length of detention influenced decisions. The most vulnerable would leave first. The SS Marine Falcon sat moored in Manila Harbor on January 18, 1946. This vessel would carry history's first group of repatriated Japanese women and children under the new program. The ship's manifest, preserved in Naval Transportation Service records, listed specific numbers that represented human lives. 127 women would make the journey. 48 children would accompany their mothers toward an uncertain future. All passengers fell into categories designated for immediate return. Medical clearances had been obtained. Security reviews had been completed. Background investigations had found no grounds for continued detention. These families qualified for the first journey home. Major Brennan stood on the Manila dock that January morning, watching women she had guarded for nearly a year. They walked up the gangplank toward freedom and uncertainty in equal measure. Her diary entry from that day revealed the complex emotions surrounding departure. Fumiko Tanaka boarded with her 3 children after 16 months of detention. Her husband had worked for the Japanese Postal Service in occupied Manila. This employment had triggered her family's detention when American forces liberated the city. Today, she was returning to a country she hadn't seen in 4 years. The Japan awaiting her return might be unrecognizable. The city she remembered might no longer exist. The husband she hoped to find might be dead or imprisoned. Yet she thanked Major Brennan as she departed. Gratitude from prisoner to jailer created uncomfortable emotions. Brennan had been Fumiko's captor, not her protector. The boundary between duty and humanity remained blurred. The journey to Japan required 6 days of ocean travel. Navy records document that Marine Falcon sailed with minimal escort protection. Submarine threats had been eliminated with Japan's surrender. The greatest dangers now came from rough weather and the emotional trauma of returnees approaching an unknown homeland. Women and children occupied converted cargo holds fitted with temporary bunks. The accommodations were basic but adequate. Medical personnel accompanied the voyage to manage expected seasickness. Pregnant women required monitoring throughout the journey. Young children needed constant attention to prevent accidents or emotional breakdowns. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hayes served as the ship's executive officer and maintained detailed logs throughout the voyage. His entries remained classified until 1995, when declassification revealed the emotional journey experienced by returning detainees. January 22nd found the ship nearing Japanese waters as the mood among returnees shifted dramatically. Relief at leaving detention gave way to mounting anxiety about what awaited them. Women began asking officers for information about specific cities and neighborhoods. They wanted to know if their homes still existed. They needed reassurance that something familiar would greet their return. The ship's crew had no answers to provide. Intelligence reports focused on military occupation requirements, not civilian infrastructure. Weather forecasts promised arrival at Yokohama on January 24th, assuming port facilities remained operational. No one could guarantee what the women would find upon arrival. The arrival at Yokohama on January 24th, 1946, exposed the full scope of Japan's devastation to returnees who had been shielded from such knowledge during detention. The port city had once thrived as a commercial center serving 900,000 residents. American firebombing raids had reduced this metropolis to scattered ruins. Commander Hayes's log described the scene that greeted the returning women. Yokohama was destroyed beyond recognition. Perhaps 15% of structures remained standing. The port facilities operated at minimal capacity with a few intact piers and some temporary buildings. Evidence of reconstruction efforts was visible, but the scale of destruction overwhelmed any progress made. The women gathered on deck fell silent when their homeland came into view. Several began weeping as reality replaced hope. One woman, perhaps 4 years old, simply repeated the same words over and over. Uso, uso, lies, lies. She seemed to refuse accepting what her eyes clearly showed her. The reception process at Yokohama revealed another challenge that planners had failed to anticipate. Japanese officials operated from temporary buildings near the waterfront with resources stretched beyond capacity. The bureaucracy required to process returnees exceeded their capabilities entirely. Identity verification required extensive documentation that often no longer existed. Locating surviving family members demanded communication networks that had been destroyed. Arranging onward transportation needed vehicles and fuel that were desperately scarce. Women who expected to reach home within days found themselves housed in temporary shelters near the port. Captain Donnelly had accompanied the first repatriation ship as liaison officer between American and Japanese authorities. His report filed on February 3, 1946, detailed the complete breakdown in Japanese reception infrastructure. The returnees were being housed in a converted warehouse with minimal facilities. Japanese authorities were attempting their best efforts, but lacked essential resources. Transportation was nearly non-existent. Personnel were overwhelmed by demands far exceeding their capacity. Women slept on concrete floors with single blankets as their only comfort. Food consisted of rice gruel served twice daily. Children asked why they had left one camp only to arrive at another. Captain Donnelly had no answer that made sense to confused and frightened children who had expected freedom to look different from captivity. The International Red Cross established a dedicated presence at Yokohama specifically to assist returnees navigate the chaos of repatriation. Delegate Margareta Hoffman's reports from February 1946 documented her efforts to connect women with surviving family members and facilitate their movement to home regions. Her February 15th report noted specific progress and ongoing challenges. Of the 127 women returned on the first ship, 89 had successfully departed for their home regions. The remaining 38 women remained stranded in Yokohama for heartbreaking reasons. Their home cities had been completely destroyed with no infrastructure remaining. Others had been unable to locate any surviving relatives after extensive searches. These 38 women existed in a peculiar state that defied easy categorization. They were free from American detention but trapped in their devastated homeland with nowhere to go. They had achieved repatriation only to discover that home no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The fate of these 38 women became symbolic of a larger tragedy affecting thousands of displaced Japanese. They had survived war, detention, and repatriation only to find themselves homeless in their own country. Some eventually relocated to rural areas where food was more readily available. Others remained among Yokohama's ruins, joining thousands of displaced Japanese struggling to survive the immediate post-war period. Their stories survived in fragmentary Red Cross reports and occasional letters that traced paths through the chaos of defeated Japan. They worked in reconstruction efforts when work could be found. They searched endlessly for lost relatives who might or might not still be alive. They attempted to rebuild lives from absolute zero with no resources and no support systems. As repatriation ships continued departing Manila throughout the spring of 1946, a troubling reality emerged that military planners had never considered. Not all detained Japanese women wanted to return to Japan. The assumption of universal desire for repatriation proved false when faced with individual circumstances that made return impossible or potentially fatal. By April 1946, exactly 64 women had formally petitioned American authorities for permission to remain in the Philippines or emigrate to other destinations. Their requests created legal and diplomatic complications that military officials were completely unprepared to handle. No precedent existed for detained enemy nationals requesting continued detention to avoid mandatory repatriation. War Department document WD-738F remained classified until 1987, when declassification revealed the careful categorization of these exceptional cases. Military bureaucrats had divided the petitions into 4 distinct groups based on circumstances that made return to Japan problematic or dangerous. The first group consisted of 23 women who had married Filipino men before or during the Japanese occupation. These marriages created complex legal problems under both Japanese and American law. Japanese wartime legislation prohibited marriage to non-Japanese nationals in occupied territories. Women who had violated these laws faced potential prosecution upon return to Japan. Teresa Nakamura had been born Reiko Sato before marrying Filipino merchant Antonio Nakamura in 1942. Her petition filed on March 15, 1946, explained her impossible situation with heartbreaking clarity. She was legally married under Philippine law to a Filipino citizen. Her husband had survived the occupation by hiding from Japanese authorities. He was now petitioning for her release from American detention. But return to Japan would mean her marriage would not be recognized by Japanese authorities. She would face prosecution for fraternizing with enemy nationals during wartime. She existed trapped between 2 nations, belonging fully to neither, welcome in neither. The second group included 18 women who had converted to Christianity during their detention period. Many conversions had occurred through interactions with American military chaplains or missionary visitors to detention facilities. These religious conversions, carefully documented in chaplain reports, preserved at the Army Chaplain Corps Oral History Center, carried severe social stigma in post-war Japan. Converting to Christianity represented cultural betrayal in traditional Japanese society. Women feared ostracism, family disownment, or worse, if they returned home as Christian converts. The religious transformation that had provided comfort during detention became a barrier to repatriation. Private correspondence from Chaplain Robert Morrison described one particularly poignant case that illustrated the dilemma faced by converted detainees. He had baptized Yuki Hayashi on December 8, 1945, after 5 months of religious instruction. She had attended services regularly, read scripture extensively, and asked profound theological questions that demonstrated genuine faith. Her transformation appeared authentic and meaningful. But she told Chaplain Morrison that returning to her village as a Christian would make her a permanent outcast. Her family would disown her completely. She asked if any possibility existed for remaining in the Philippines or relocating to a Christian nation where her faith would be accepted. Chaplain Morrison had no answer to provide her. Military regulations required repatriation regardless of religious conversion. Humanitarian concerns couldn't override legal obligations to return enemy nationals. The third group consisted of 15 women who carried pregnancies resulting from sexual assault during the chaotic period surrounding Japanese surrender and American liberation of the Philippines. These women faced perhaps the most tragic circumstances of all petitioners. The pregnancies had resulted from attacks by unknown assailants during the confusion of regime change. Some attacks had been carried out by retreating Japanese soldiers. Others had been committed by Filipino insurgents. Some pregnancies may have resulted from assaults by American personnel, though no documentation explicitly stated this possibility. Returning to Japan while pregnant with children of uncertain paternity would guarantee social destruction for these women. Japanese society would consider them permanently ruined. Their children would face lifelong status as outcasts with no possibility of normal social integration. Major Brennan's April 22, 1946. Diary entry addressed this particular tragedy with barely contained anguish. She had met with 7 pregnant women who had petitioned to remain in American custody rather than face repatriation. None would identify the specific circumstances of their pregnancies. The shame was overwhelming and complete. In Japan, they would be considered ruined women whose children would be eternal outcasts. They were asking if American authorities could help them settle somewhere, anywhere other than Japan. The irony was bitter and inescapable. American forces had detained these women against their will. Now some were begging not to be released. The fourth group numbered 8 women who simply stated they had no one and nothing to return to in Japan. Their families were dead, killed by bombing or starvation. Their homes had been destroyed beyond any possibility of reconstruction. Their prospects for survival in devastated Japan were negligible at best. These women explicitly requested permission to remain in Allied custody indefinitely rather than face certain destitution in their homeland. They preferred continued detention to freedom that offered only slow death by starvation or exposure. The legal framework for handling these petitions simply did not exist in American military law or international treaties. The women were classified as enemy nationals subject to mandatory repatriation under existing agreements between Allied powers and Japan. But forcing repatriation on women who faced persecution, violence, or death seemed to violate the humanitarian principles the United States claimed to uphold in its conduct of the war and occupation. The Immigration and Naturalization Service, the State Department, and the War Department engaged in months of bureaucratic debate, while the petitioning women remained in detention. Each agency claimed the others held jurisdiction. Legal precedents were non-existent. Policymakers struggled with contradictions between military regulations and humanitarian obligations. Captain Eleanor Hutchison now served as chief liaison for special cases and documented the bureaucratic paralysis in her May 1946 report. American authorities had created situations that would have impressed Kafka with their absurd contradictions. Women were simultaneously petitioning for release from detention and requesting to remain in American custody. They wanted freedom, but could not accept repatriation. They sought liberty while asking to remain imprisoned. Military officials lacked any legal mechanism to resolve these impossible contradictions, so the women waited in limbo, while bureaucrats in Washington debated jurisdiction and precedent. The eventual resolution came through a series of individual exceptions rather than systematic policy changes. No comprehensive solution was ever developed. Each case was handled separately through administrative improvisation. Some women received special dispensations to remain in the Philippines under Filipino government supervision. Others were granted humanitarian immigration exceptions, allowing relocation to allied nations willing to accept them. A few cases were simply closed administratively, with women released into Manila's population without formal documentation. These women became effectively stateless persons with no legal nationality or protection. By August 1946, all formal petitions had been resolved through one mechanism or another. But the resolutions often amounted to passing responsibility from military to civilian authorities without actually solving the underlying problems these women faced. Their situations remained precarious even after military detention ended. The last Japanese woman departed American detention on November 3, 1946, marking 847 days since the first women had been detained in February 1945. Major Catherine Brennan, who had overseen Camp Clayton through its entire existence, recorded the facility's closure in her final diary entry. The final detainee was Hanako Yamamoto, the teacher who had petitioned for school supplies, who had taught children throughout their captivity, who had maintained dignity through 18 months of detention. She thanked Major Brennan again as she departed. Brennan still didn't know what to do with that gratitude expressed by former prisoners. American forces had taken 2 years from these women's lives, and they thanked their captors for treating them humanely within that theft. The moral arithmetic refused to balance. Good treatment during unjust imprisonment didn't resolve the fundamental injustice of the imprisonment itself. The official records of Japanese female detention during World War II remain remarkably sparse given the significance of what occurred. The War Department's final statistical report, compiled in December 1946, reduced the entire human experience to cold numbers that revealed nothing about the suffering involved. 847 women had been detained over the course of the program. 203 children had accompanied them. 12 facilities had housed them at various times. 847 days represented the maximum detention period served. 0 escapes were recorded throughout the entire program. 0 major security incidents had occurred. 64 special case petitions had been filed. The total cost to U.S. taxpayers reached $2.3 million. But the human story contained within those statistics proved far more complex and far more significant than official documentation suggested or acknowledged. The detention of Japanese women had exposed fundamental tensions in how America conducted warfare and occupation. Tensions existed between military necessity and humanitarian principles. Conflicts arose between desires for vengeance and commitments to justice. Contradictions emerged between seeing enemies as threats and recognizing them as human beings deserving basic rights and dignity. The women who returned to Japan carried their detention experiences into post-war Japanese society, though few spoke openly about what they had endured during the final years of war. Cultural stigma surrounding capture and detention meant that many women never told their own families the complete truth about where they had been and what they had experienced. Japanese militarism had trained citizens to view surrender and capture as ultimate shame that could never be overcome. Post-war Japanese society reinforced these views rather than challenging them. Speaking about detention meant admitting to shame that society preferred to ignore or forget. Research conducted by Tokyo University historian Dr. Takashi Yamada in the 1980s attempted to locate and interview former detainees to preserve their experiences before all witnesses died. His published findings in 1989 documented the continued silence surrounding detention experiences. Of 127 women Dr. Yamada successfully located through various records and contacts, only 31 agreed to be interviewed about their experiences. Most of those who did agree refused to allow their real names to be published in any research or historical accounts. One woman, identified only as Mrs. K to protect her privacy, told Dr. Yamada about the lasting impact of social stigma. For 40 years, she had told people she was in the countryside during the final year of war. This lie was easier than explaining that she had been detained by American forces. People would assume she had been a comfort woman or something worse if they knew the truth about her detention. The truth was complicated and difficult to explain. Japanese society preferred simple stories about the war that didn't require examination of complex moral questions. The American personnel who had operated detention facilities carried their own complex legacies from the experience. Major Brennan returned to teaching in Pennsylvania after the war, rarely discussing her wartime service with colleagues or family members. The experience had changed her understanding of duty and humanity, but those changes remained private. Captain Donnelly became a school principal and lifelong advocate for international understanding between former enemies. His experience with Japanese detainees had convinced him that education was essential for preventing future conflicts based on racial or cultural hatred. Lieutenant Morrison found post-war work with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, applying lessons learned at Camp Clayton to refugee crises around the world. His understanding of how quickly ordinary people could become displaced persons informed his humanitarian work for decades. Most of the enlisted women who had served as guards simply returned to civilian life and private silence about their military service. The complexities of guarding enemy civilians didn't fit easily into heroic narratives about the good war that dominated post-war American culture. Virginia Hewlett, the former attorney whose investigations had transformed the detention system, spent the remainder of her life advocating for humanitarian treatment of detainees, regardless of their nationality or the conflicts involved. Her experience had taught her that institutional pressures could corrupt good intentions if constant vigilance was not maintained. She testified before Congress in 1951 during debates over Korean War detention policies. She appeared again in 1971 regarding Vietnam War POW treatment. Her message remained consistent throughout decades of advocacy work. In a 1978 interview for the Veterans History Project, she reflected on lessons learned from her wartime experience. Her work investigating Japanese detention camps had taught her about the human capacity for cruelty when authority was unchecked. Her experience visiting Camp Clayton had taught her about the constant vigilance required to prevent Americans from becoming what they fought against. The distance between just detention and systematic abuse was smaller than Americans wanted to believe. Good intentions were not sufficient protection against institutional failures that could transform defenders of freedom into oppressors of the innocent. The children of detention represent perhaps the most enduring legacy of the entire program. Those who were young enough during detention to not fully remember their time behind barbed wire often learned about their experiences only decades later when family histories were finally discussed openly. Some discovered their birth certificates listed Camp Clayton as their birthplace, creating questions about identity that parents had hoped to avoid forever. The psychological impact of early childhood detention, even when not consciously remembered, influenced lifelong patterns of anxiety, attachment, and identity formation that researchers are only now beginning to understand. In 2015, 70 years after the war's end, the Japanese government quietly erected a small memorial at Yokohama Port, honoring civilian detainees who suffered hardship during repatriation. The memorial makes no specific mention of detention by Allied forces, reflecting Japan's ongoing reluctance to address the complexities of its wartime history with complete honesty. But for the few surviving women who had experienced detention, the memorial represented a form of acknowledgement, however indirect and incomplete. Their suffering had been recognized, even if the full story remained untold and largely unknown to younger generations. The story of Japanese female detainees in World War II remains largely absent from popular histories of the Pacific War that focus on combat heroism, strategic decisions, and the atomic bombs that ended the conflict. The narratives Americans tell about that war emphasize clear moral distinctions between good and evil that leave little room for examining the gray areas where policy failures created unnecessary suffering. But in the spaces between major events that dominate historical memory, 847 women and their children experienced a different kind of war. Theirs was a conflict of bureaucratic confusion, unexpected humanity, and moral complexity that defied simple characterization as either justice or cruelty, either necessary security measures or pointless persecution. Their experience serves as a reminder that war's impact extends far beyond battlefields where armies clash and heroes emerge. How societies treat those over whom they have power defines them as clearly as how they fight those who oppose them. The measure of American character during World War II included not only victories won, but also how prisoners were treated when victory was assured.